These are very, very strange times indeed, in many respects. But I'm very, very excited to be part of this 28th version of the festival and to be able to conduct here in this wonderful studio the first interview with one of the authors at the festival. It's no other than Paul Mendez. We will talk about 35, 40 minutes maybe during our conversation. You can ask questions. And the questions, how does it work? You can find a Q&A button on your Zoom device. And that's where you can ask the questions. But there's also a chat box. And in that box, you can ask questions about technicalities or other stuff. But in the Q&A button, you can ask questions to the author directly. And hopefully, they will come up after our interview. Paul Mendez is a young British author who wrote his first novel called Rainbow Milk. It's a very, very exciting novel that ranges from 1958 until 2016, mainly in the Brexit era. And it's about a young black gay man who was brought up in the Jehovah's Witnesses also. And basically he leaves his house in search of a home, a true place where he can be himself and where he can be respected and he can find out what he really wants in life. It's very brutal, it's a harsh, very poetic, it's a very moving book about this young man, and I'm really happy that I can talk to the author right now. So Paul, hi. A warm welcome to you also to this festival, and I can see you really clearly. And my first question is obviously, how are you doing tonight?
I'm very well, thank you. Very, excuse me, very busy, very sort of tired, but very excited. I'm hoping, like most of us, that there'll be a new president in the next 24 hours in the United States.
To start with that, obviously, what do you think? Well, what do you hope for? But what do you think what will happen tonight?
I know as much as you do, really. No. I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen because, it's just all it's a very strange time. It's a very uncertain time. And I really feel like the decision that the American public comes up with really sort of have a strong effect on how we sort of end the year and how we sort of move forward, like globally, I think.
Yeah. Will you be watching during the night, Paul, or will you see it just in the morning and hope for the best? Because I can clearly remember 4 years ago, I just went to sleep like so many people and thinking, oh, this will be fine. And then in the morning, I think at 6:30, switched on the television and it was all red.
Yes, I was talking to my partner about this today. So I used to sort of subscribe to the notifications on the Guardian website or the Guardian app.
Yeah.
But the morning that the Brexit vote was announced, I got that absolutely horrible notification to say that Britain had left the EU.
Yeah.
And we, my friendship group, we're all Remainers. So we all thought, this is going to be fine. We're going to win. So it was a real shock and one that I was very, very uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
So I switched off notifications before the US election because I didn't want to know before I was ready. I will watch the news at 10 this evening, the BBC, but I will probably sort of leave it there and then go to bed. I've got a book signing tomorrow, so need to be fresh for that.
That's still possible in the UK to do a book signing. Is it with live people coming to?
No, it's I wrote a short story for an anthology that's coming out sort of later this year, so I have to go and sign 1,000 copies in the morning.
No worries. 1,000, excellent. Something to look forward to. About your amazing book, Paul, Rainbow Milk. Before we're going to talk about the book, I often notice during interviews, whether it's written or live, that a lot of authors don't really like if we talk about the autobiographical aspects of the book, because a lot of people in interviews would want to know, did that happen to you? Did you feel the same about all this stuff? So before we start the interview, can I ask you the question? Do you feel it's a very personal book in the sense that I can talk about it like I can talk about Jesse, the main character, the narrator of the book, but is it okay to say that it really comes very close to you as a person, Paul?
Yes, it's a very personal book, and it is based on or inspired by my own experiences. I think is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
I and Jessie share the fact that we were both raised Jehovah's Witnesses in the West Midlands of England. We're both from Jamaican backgrounds. We both, became sex workers, moved to London, etc., etc. Worked in hospitality. But every scene in that book is my creation. Every character is my creation. Even Jessie is my creation.
Yeah.
So while he is my avatar to sort of explore some of my intersections, I've created him to do that. And that's sort of what people forget sometimes. It's the craft behind fiction.
Yeah.
Whether that person's sort of based on you or not. I'm writing about someone who's 19 years old. I'm 38. So, that's, I don't remember necessarily. I remember some of the sort of, broad brush strokes, if you like, but, all the sort of like intimate moments or the intricacies of what it's like to be a 19-year-old boy who comes from a very strict religious background and is sort of throwing himself into a very, very different life in the metropolis. I don't really remember how that feels. And so I really had to enter a different space. And I had to do that through research. I had to sort of really sort of look back at what that time was like in London in the early 2000s. Yeah. And indeed, I moved him to London 2 years before I moved to London. So, I just really had to sort of be absolutely correct about everything apropos.
I always find it very interesting, Paul, when an author says, yes, it's my story, I crafted it, but how can you say something about how does that work? How do you put that craftsmanship between you as a person in certain scenes and what we read as a reader about Jessie? Can you say something? How does that work? What happens inside of you when you do that?
Well, you know what? The most interesting part of the process for me is research. Yeah. And that can take on lots of different forms. I love listening to music, especially to write. So, I've grown up with pop music all my life. I've grown up with the radio on all my life. And so for me, music has a really sort of strong, it's a really strong anchoring device to a particular time in history. Yeah. So, when I sort of thought, what was sort of happening in the spring of 2002, I immediately sort of thought of music as a way in to that. And also sort of researching things like, what art exhibitions were on in London at the time and, what might I have been reading? What might Jessie have been reading? I guess, though, the main sort of aspect of the process is the fact that Rainbow Milk is largely based on sort of autobiographical fragments that I've kept in journals for about the last 20 years.
Okay, you've always kept a journal from which age on? From puberty or from late?
Sort of about the age of 18, 19, I've kept journals, and I've got most of them still with me here.
Wow, that's very special.
So, yeah, I mean, I hardly ever sort of cite them really, but what I've done over the years is I've written and rewritten the same stories over and over and over again. Partly as a means of sort of reminding myself of who I was, but also just, for the sake of writing and, charting, how far I've come as a person. And it's those fragments that sort of comprised the main foundations of the book.
Okay, I understand. A part of the book that you really needed to do research for probably is the beginning of the book. It starts with a section, like I was saying in the introduction, and it starts in 1958 in Jamaica. And it's basically about the grandparents of Jessie who moved to Great Britain later on. They are part of the so-called Windrush generation. That's something I don't think many Dutch readers or people around the world anyway know what it is. Could you explain a little bit what you mean? What is the Windrush generation?
Sure. So in 1948, Britain introduced a new Nationality Act. So this meant that all Commonwealth citizens were now British citizens.
Yeah.
At the time, it was sort of meant as a means of inviting people from places like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, to come and live and work in Great Britain and help with the post-war effort in terms of rebuilding the country. But the then Labour government, who sort of introduced this Nationality Act, didn't insert any language to suggest that people from the Caribbean or the Indian subcontinent, who were also members of the Commonwealth, were not supposed to be coming over here to take jobs. So there was this kind of very sort of difficult moment where they couldn't sort of change the law and sort of make it explicit that brown people and black people weren't welcome, certainly after Britain had just sort of, gained the moral high ground in the world by defeating Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
So what it had to prepare itself for was an influx of people from the Caribbean and from South Asia. And my grandparents are part of that generation. It's called Windrush because there was a ship called SS Windrush, which had been a German warship. But after the war had been requisitioned during the war had been requisitioned by Britain and sort of turned into a passenger ship. And it was that ship that was used to sort of ferry passengers from the UK to the Caribbean and back. And at one point in 1948, it was something like £23 to travel from the Caribbean to the UK on the Windrush. And so you get this sort of quite iconic journey, leaving Southampton, sailing down to Trinidad, and then coming back up through Jamaica and up through some of the other islands, and then back up to where it docked at Tilbury in Essex on the 22nd of June, 1948. And there were sort of reporters there waiting to sort of greet the passengers. There were 492 men and I think 25 women on board. People will correct me on that. And one of them was Lord Kitchener, the sort of Trinidadian Calypsonian, who gave this really iconic sort of London is the place for me song whilst disembarking from the ship. And, that was sort of spread on Pathé News, on BBC News, etc. Apparently, the Evening Standard sent a plane with a little message saying, welcome our new sort of citizens or something. So it was really iconic. And despite the fact that there were several ships that were doing this, despite the fact that this was a 20-year period, I guess until the 1962 Immigration Act, which made it much more difficult, by which time 500,000 people had come from the West Indies to live in the UK. But just that moment that the Windrush docked on the 22nd of June, 1948 was super iconic. So it just became emblematic of that whole generation. So as I said, my grandparents were part of that sort of 500,000 influx, and they came here in 1956 on one side, 1957 on the other. Yeah. It was a great sort of spell of research for me to sort of figure out what their lives would have been like, the reasons for them coming here.
Were there any letters, or did they make notes themselves? Did they have diaries, or do you know something about the journey, or nothing?
No, my grandparents have always been very circumspect about their past, and I think that's quite a common thing actually amongst people from that generation.
Why is that? Is that out of why, shame or guilt maybe or something?
Not at all. I think it's to do with maybe partly that actually. I hadn't really thought of that, but I think certainly just the idea that they wanted to move here for a better life. Yeah, post World War II. I mean, during World War II, there were lots of economic and environmental issues going on in Jamaica. And, if I'm taking that as an example, at that time, there was a terrible earthquake in 1944 that sort of followed on from other terrible earthquakes that had sort of damaged the crop. The American sort of seasonal work had ended during the war as well. So it was sort of quite desperate in Jamaica at the time. And also, countries like Ghana had started to sort of declare independence, sort of setting off a sort of chain reaction of former colonial countries becoming independent from Britain. And Jamaica, would have Jamaicans would have thought, well, when is that going to happen for us? Lots of Jamaicans also had volunteered for the armed forces during the Second World War, and had sort of returned back to the country, much more sort of civilized and sort of educated, and et cetera, et cetera. So there was just this real sense, on top of the fact that so many, all Caribbean children were sort of given this colonial education, which sort of dictated the image of Britain as being this kind of really masterful, sort of all-conquering nation.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to move here. Everybody thought that was, the way
Britannia
forward.
rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it just became the dream. And when they got here, it was, we're not Jamaican anymore, we're English. We're trying to sort of integrate.
Yeah.
We want our children to be English. We want our grandchildren to be English. We want them to have a better education than we had, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a real sense of like, don't look back, look forwards.
Yeah.
And I really got that sense from my grandparents. And I based the opening section of Rainbow Milk on the very, very few details that I know of my paternal grandfather, who passed away in 1958, 1959, who my dad never met.
No.
Or was too young to remember him. And just the fact that he was very tall, very good looking, and as soon as he moved to the UK, started to suffer migraine headaches and blurred vision.
Yeah.
And eventually lost his sight to the point that he couldn't work anymore. And so my grandmother sort of said, look, I can't look after you and work 2 jobs and look after the children. You have to go back to Jamaica. And so he did while she stayed. And that's all I knew of him.
Wow.
And it wasn't really until, because we don't study this in school.
No.
Yeah, in this country, in England.
No, the same in the Netherlands.
Right. So it really sort of, I got to the age of sort of maybe in my early 30s before I started really looking into it. And it was through, reading Small Island by Andrea Levy and The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvin and other books that I was really able to sort of, it was sort of a revelation to me because it was the first time that I was ever reading about my grandparents.
How did you come across those books? Did you have people in your vicinity that handed them to you, or how did you know about these books? How did you talk to other people from the Windrush generation who knew maybe parts of that history? How did you come in contact with them?
Well, Small Island is a very famous book here.
Yeah.
It won the Women's Prize for Fiction. Yeah. Back in 2004, and was turned into a TV series. I missed all of that, to be honest. And it didn't come into my hands until, I used to do a little bit of like audiobook reading, like narration. And also was working for a production company in terms of helping them quality control audiobooks. And Andrea Levy had recorded Small Island herself in her own voice, like done all the characters and everything. It was fantastic. And I had the quality to control it. And so she was reading this to me and I was reading the text at the same time. And I was just like, wow, like, I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know. The Windrush generation as a phrase has only really sort of existed for about 3 or 4 years after the Windrush scandal broke. Okay. In which I'm not sure if the audience are aware, but so the Home Office systematically destroyed members of the Windrush generation's landing cards.
Okay.
So if they couldn't prove that they were British citizens because they didn't have a landing card, then they were put up for deportation. Yeah. And I think something like 2,000 people were deported wrongly.
Wow.
Some people died in limbo, not able to get a job. If you're not a citizen officially, you can't, apply for jobs. You can't necessarily stay in your council flat if that's what your accommodation is, etc., etc. So it was a total nightmare, and that's what really brought that generation of people into the national consciousness, and to be honest, into mine, because I just always sort of took for granted that my parents were born here, my grandparents came here in the 50s. You know, that doesn't necessarily mean anything to you when you're young and you're growing up and doing your own thing. So it was a real revelation to me. And then, of course, you know, going into a little bit more research and reading, you sort of come across books like Sam Salvin's The Lonely Londoners and The Immigrants by George Lamming, and, you know, various other books I really can't think off the top of my head now what I was reading at that time. And also, you know, Marlon James winning the Booker Prize for A Brief History of Seven Killings.
Great book.
Just, you know, incredible book, but really sort of got me thinking about the voice in Caribbean fiction. And
so what did you see in that book that represents that kind of voice? Is it the language literally, because it's quite difficult to read in English because it's in patois, I think, mainly. And in your book, there are large parts of people who have different accents. I read it in English, and because it hasn't been translated in the Netherlands, and that sometimes that was a little difficult, but mainly because of the sound and the musicality of the words, you can really follow that. But was Marlon James in that respect an example for you as well?
Yes, it definitely influenced me. Well, he you know, reading A Brief History of Seven Killings gave me permission to write in Jamaican Creole.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd ever sort of read anything in Creole before that.
No.
Maybe, I mean, The Lonely Londoners is written in Trinidadian Creole, but Jamaican Creole is quite different. And I found it incredibly easy to do. I mean, you know, like I said, I was born here. I'm super English.
Yeah.
Like, you know. But, you know, I grew up with my Jamaican grandparents who, you know, never let go of their accents and sort of ways of speaking. Yeah. And so I heard them and their friends' voices when I was writing Norman's character in first person. But certainly I, you know, was very much inspired by Marlon James.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, when you're writing about people from the Caribbean, it doesn't matter whether you're writing about them in the Caribbean or here in the UK, you're seeing it through their eyes, and you can't really do that in standard English.
No.
You know, I mean, it's a language in itself, and it's, you know, it's a thought process that's attached to certain ways of speaking and certain gestures and certain sort of passions that sort of can manifest themselves even quite physically. Yeah. And that then is translated into language as well. So did it also give you, sorry to interrupt, did it also give you the liberty for other characters in the book who have different accents, like from the Midlands or very strong London accents, which is for a Dutch? I mean, we always learn in school that we think we can speak English quite well, but if you read these kind of English or accents, then you're completely lost sometimes. But it gave you, it adds to the whole story. It makes it very, very lively as well. Well, we in the UK are exceptionally jealous of you Dutch for your linguistic skills, and I'm sure if there was someone in Holland who was writing in a sort of in Dutch and in a nation language, even if I could speak and read Dutch, I would find it extremely difficult. So I totally understand what you're saying. We wouldn't survive a day if we would get out on the streets of Wolverhampton, for example, and not even an hour, because we would be completely lost. It's got nothing to do with our English. We sort of get taught the Queen's English very properly. Well, I think so many accents are becoming, so many British accents are becoming like one accent now. I mean, there are different accents, of course, different regional accents, but, you know, dialects are really sort of dying, because I think that's, you know, the proliferation of certain sort of very sort of centralizing dialect in the standard English. But could it have been written any other way in really proper clean English? Because it's a very, like I was saying in the introduction, it's a very street kind of book, and it's very tough prose. You're telling your story in, because after the first section of the book that's set in Jamaica and coming to the UK to be workers here, we go to see Jessie,
who's a young man in the Midlands, a very, very harsh, very industrialized part of the country in Great Britain. And he's with his family, part of the Jehovah's Witnesses, a religious group that believes that there will be sort of an end of the world kind of day, sort of reckoning, and then everybody like me will be dissolved into the earth or in the air or whatever, except for this small group of people who are the true believers and they can live on forever, etc. There's only one and he's very much into it because he's being taught the Bible. He's a very clear boy who is an example to the whole community because he knows his Bible and he's so well behaved, etc. But there comes a point that he starts to feel he likes men. He's a gay man and he doesn't know what to do with his feelings, and then it comes out, and then he has to leave the community. He's excommunicated, which is really, well, you're really basically on your own. Then nobody is allowed to speak to you anymore, not even your family. So he decides to leave for London, and then the book really sets off in a very strong, fast-moving kind of pace, and then he has to find his own place for himself. A lot of things happen, and what I was curious about was how did Jesse? What was the first time? Did he have any reference when it comes to his homosexual feelings in books or in other kind of literature, things he heard on the street, or is he just really out on himself and he has to find out everything there's to know about it? How was that for you?
So speaking of Jesse, I think his first sort of moment of seeing what's possible as a queer man is when he is still in the Midlands, as a Jehovah's Witness, preaching from door to door, and he knocks on the door and a young man answers, who's topless, wearing tracksuit bottoms. And it's September the 11th, 2001, and the news is on. And the householder just sort of goes back into his house and leaves the door open, hinting that Jesse can follow him into the house to see what's happening on the news. And Jesse sort of walks into this situation where you've got two men, one South Asian, one white, sitting on a couch together. The place is slightly messy. You've got their video games and stuff like in front of the television. They're smoking a joint, etc. But they're watching 9/11 unfold. Yeah. The attacks on New York and Washington. And for someone like Jesse, who is raised to one day expect one day that Armageddon is going to happen.
This is it. This is the moment.
To see 9/11 unfold on TV while you're on field service on the ministry is, it's pretty scary. But what's going on in this scene is Jesse and these two men are watching this unfold, but then Jesse starts to notice that the two men are very, very tactile and affectionate with each other and really supporting each other through this trauma. And it sort of dawns on Jesse that they're a gay couple. And, they're two masculine men. In his head, gay couples only exist where one is, where it's a kind of heteronormative relationship where one is the girl and the other's the boy. And, it's all very sort of, easy to understand from a heteronormative perspective. But, his mind is blown completely in this situation. And it's, the very fact that they are there for each other to support each other through watching 9/11 and, all of the collateral immediately that sort of brings to bear. That really sort of is the first time that he kind of envisages that this could be him, that he could have this kind of life with someone one day. And so that sort of is part of this sort of chain reaction that happens. But I think once he's disfellowshipped as well from the Jehovah's Witnesses, there's a sense that he's got nothing to lose, and that, you were saying earlier, people like yourself, simply because you're not a Jehovah's Witness, would die at Armageddon. And yet Jesse is finding more love outside the organization than he is finding inside it, where he's been very sort of cruelly disposed of.
Yeah.
And so there needs to start a process of almost decolonization from the witnesses. I don't know what the word would be in terms of, or de-indoctrination, actually.
Yeah, probably that, yeah.
From the witness sort of program that he's sort of always known. I mean, let's be clear. The Jehovah's Witness community, like, got nothing against them, like, wonderful group of people in their space.
Yeah.
But they are anti-gay, anti-trans, anti-abortion, they're basically a right-wing sect.
Yeah.
And that's what Jess has grown up in, and that's not who he is.
No.
As a young queer black man, that's not who he is. And he doesn't know that to be able to say that straight away. But he knows that he has to set himself on a journey as far away from that as possible to become himself.
Yeah. There's obviously, and you probably have been talking about this a lot, but the sex in this book is very, to say the least, graphic. It's very strong, it's very powerful. And I know, in normal life, I'm an editor at a publishing house, and I know how hard it is for a writer to write about sex. Because you've got something like the Bad Sex Award, because most sex scenes in books are horrible, are really ghastly. People don't know how to write about sex, but you can. And I just don't understand how. How did you, are you aware that you learned something, or is this just how you wrote it down in the first place? How do you know about yourself that the sex scenes you're writing are not pathetic or awkward or whatever?
I think if I'm aroused myself, then I think I'm doing a good job.
Of course. Yeah, that's it, basically.
When I read other sex scenes, when I read other people's sex scenes, if I'm cringing, then I know I don't need to copy that. No. That's not the way to go. But if I find it hot, then, that's the right way. I think the mistake that people make with sex, and I think because Jesse's sex is a very particular kind of sex, it's not marital, it's not sort of nice and sort of clean and lovely. It's in, train station toilets and, in gay bar toilets. Yeah. And, it's not planned. It's kind of, it's messy, it's dirty, it's smelly, and it's about the senses, and it's about, the real sort of immediate experience of it. And you don't have poetry for that. You don't have time to, to conceive of those words. It's just about what you see, what you smell, what you hear, what you taste.
Exactly. The rawness of it makes it so very good. And I don't read that a lot in modern day fiction, very oddly enough, because we're supposed to be very liberal and liberated and whatever. But writing about sex is still very, very difficult for a lot of people because they romanticize it somewhat. And most of the time it's very animal-like, really, and very ugly sometimes. Yeah. And that's very good. And then throughout the book, basically until 2016, we come to know Jesse a lot better and to live with him through his ups and downs. But basically throughout the book, what's very interesting is that he, as he further matures and he's much more sensible towards himself, and he knows where he's heading and he knows who he is, he gets more angry as well, basically about his past, having lived all his life in this very white, heterosexual orientated world who basically made all the rules. And in the acknowledgement of the book, you write something very striking about your publisher at Dialogue Books, saying that finally there's someone who is going for the alternative narrative in fiction. So what do you mean? How does it work for you? What do you mean by that? That is there didn't used to be a place for this kind of books? Do you feel you are very first time kind of author in that respect, or how do you see the publishing business in Great Britain at the moment? Is it more diverse? Is it more open to different kind of voices apart from you?
Yeah, I think it's sort of getting there. There's a hell of a long way to go, but I think, even compared to sort of 3 or 4 years ago, it's in a much better place. I mean, Charmaine Lovegrove became a publisher in 2017, having worked for 10 years in film and television. Well, as a literary scout, so but looking for books to be adapted to film and TV. And so she's got this sort of and before that she ran a bookshop in Berlin.
Yeah.
So she's got this very sort of unusual, what's the word? Like hybrid vision, I suppose, of what an author can be, first of all, but also of what a book can be. And, I met her at a party. We've got lots of mutual friends, and I met her at a party in sort of 2012. And right from back then, she was like, send me your work when you're ready. But it wasn't until it was announced that she'd become a publisher at Dialogue Books, so an imprint that would deliberately seek out previously underrepresented voices. So people from the LGBT community, LGBT plus community, Black and brown people, et cetera, people living with disability, people from the working classes, et cetera, they would all fall under her remit. And I kind of realized, like, okay, so now is the time, because, I'd been in literary agents' offices before, I'd been in touch with publishers before, and I just didn't fit the bill for what they were looking for as an author.
Right. What was it? What they weren't looking for actually in your story? Was it?
They were looking for the finished article. They weren't looking for someone who they would need to nurture.
Yeah, I understand.
And I think that's like where the publishing industry has changed.
Yeah.
And I think Charmaine Lovegrove, my publisher, is absolutely like 90% to do with that's.
Do you get a lot of reactions from people who read your book, especially from young authors, maybe in the same position as Jessie is in the book, or you in real life, that can feel this, that you are sort of new hope for them, or that you can they see that there's they can go someplace with their work, with their sexuality, with their background. Do you get a lot of reactions like that?
I was starting to. I was starting to hear from a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who now work very prominently in the creative arts, fantastically. So, people who are now really sort of preeminent fashion stylists and photographers and, writers themselves, et cetera, people who work in film and TV, et cetera. People like that are coming forward and saying, that's me. I really... And especially because, they might be sort of around my age and they're looking back at London in the early 2000s that I depict in Rainbow Milk. And they're saying, that is just me, coming from, the shires or the provincial parts of the country to the metropolis in the early 2000s, in this sort of sense of like a really sort of hopeful place, and coming out as gay and sort of figuring out things anew. And that's really fascinating to me. But it's also fascinating that people from all walks of life are reading the book and feeding back to me and saying that they see something, the most surprising things. So I'm studying as well at the moment. And one of my fellow students at Goldsmiths is a teacher. And one of her pupils, who's like 16, is reading Rainbow Milk. And she's, I think she's 16, sort of been quite... Yeah, I think she's been quite protective of her because obviously the adult material, but it doesn't come from an abusive place. It doesn't come from a place of gratuity. It comes from a place of lived experience and of this is what people go through. This is what happens to a young man when he, a naive and very sort of sheltered young man when he moves to London at the age of 19, he becomes someone who is, who predators will sort of take a keen interest in, and sort of make him sort of feel safe and sort of, sell themselves to him, whilst, convincing him that they can take advantage of him. Young people need to sort of be prepared for that, and sometimes they can only see it through fiction.
You can. You've become a sort of role model. You probably, or Jessie, would have needed when he was still in the Midlands. People can start asking questions in the live stream with the Q&A button on your Zoom application. So maybe is there a question already from the audience? We can have a look. There's one question here, Paul, from the audience. Are there any particular groups of people that you hope will read your book?
Well, like I was saying, I think young people, I think it would be great to see Rainbow Milk studied in colleges.
Yeah.
Kids who are sort of 17, 18 years old. I think it's slightly unavoidable when you're writing a 19-year-old character that there's going to be a slight sort of tendency towards young adult genre. And I sort of tried to avoid that actually by writing in third person. I wrote for a long time in first person and just found that my own authorial voice was being lost in this 19-year-old boy's own personal lived experience. So by switching to third person, I was finally able to sort of breathe. But I think still that young people today will sort of find something interesting in Jesse. I think people who have very, very different backgrounds to him will empathize after reading his story with queer people, black people, people who are different from them in some way, people from working class and sort of more impoverished backgrounds. It's all about empathy. It's all about presenting a character that people can not sympathize with, empathize with. I think that's it's really important to make that decision. And
because in that respect, it's a classic sort of coming of age novel as well, just about a young person trying to find a place he belongs or a place of his own, really. And so I think a lot of people
go through that. Everyone goes through that. Everyone sort of leaves home to go to university, and all of a sudden you're an 18-year-old, 19-year-old in a very, very different place and having to sort of think for yourself for the first time. And everyone's been through that. Maybe not as extremely as Jesse, maybe more extremely than Jesse. But I think he's the sort of person that a lot of people can sort of find brotherhood with.
Exactly. I think we have time for one more question. So maybe if there's another question from the audience, or I will have the final question. I can't really.
I haven't shown you my raven.
Oh, it's a raven. Do you have a raven?
I have a raven.
Crossing Border Festival local. Oh, beautiful. What book is that? Is it an ornithological book?
It's beautiful. Old Reader's Digest book of British birds. It was published in 1969. And it's absolutely gorgeous. It was just sort of
it's really beautiful.
And it's got this lovely little ribbon.
Excellent.
So
I've got one more question, Paul. Are there certain things in Rainbow Milk, certain themes or aspects that you would like to bring back in a new book, or are there other subjects you would like to dive into? Are there other subjects you'd like to dive into?
I don't know. I mean,
are you working on something right now?
Well, I'm working on things that I can't talk about.
Well, we are amongst ourselves now, so you shouldn't be afraid.
Let's just say that Rainbow Milk has an afterlife. So I'm working on projects surrounding Rainbow Milk. So for the time being, and that's a whole new sort of creative process in itself that I'm really enjoying. But I'm, really inspired by, Toni Morrison and James Baldwin and, writers who come from a particular place and write from a particular sort of collective imagination and, stick with that theme and stick with those people. I'm from the industrial West Midlands, I'm from a place where, a very right-wing sectarian parties were very popular during the 80s and 90s when I was growing up, because of the sort of disaffection caused by Margaret Thatcher's government and sort of the recessions that were visited upon our parts of the country. It's industrial, it's kind of multicultural, but very, very uncomfortably so. And I just want to sort of carry on writing about people from those worlds.
Yeah,
really.
I understand.
That's what I'll always return to anyway. But there'll always be something contemporary that will sort of turn my head. Maybe this is the more important thing to write about.
Okay.
So I'll always probably have like.
Yeah. I understand that you want to explore further themes that you wrote about in Rainbow Milk in your next book. But maybe the last question we have really is a very personal question, and it's quite moving question, because the reader would like to know that if you yourself have come to a point in your life that you have the feeling that you belong somewhere finally, and he or she is asking the question, he or she hopes so, that you have done so.
Thank you very much for that lovely question and for your care. I really am very, very happy. I could not be happier. In my own four walls, at least. I know the world is crumbling around us, but I do have wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people in my life who, many of whom have been in my life for a long time now, and they are family to me. And, I have a great family as well. And, I'm, very sort of, things have been sort of very difficult in the past, but, things have got better, I guess, or as good as good as they're going to get. And, I am absolutely privileged and, love the fact that I can sit at home and write all day.
Yeah.
Read and write and study and feel, I guess, reclaim the lost time from not being taught Black history or anything at school to do with my heritage, and sort of growing up being sort of drummed with the Bible being drummed into me, and this sort of like, this doctrine being drummed into me. I can sort of completely de-indoctrinize myself and just, fill my mind with, amazing sort of Black thought. And, I believed in creation until I was like 25 or something.
Well,
so
a lot of people still do.
I've got loads of catching up to do. And this is my full-time job now to sort of,
very good.
Like I said, just de-indoctrinate myself and really sort of assume this kind of new personality, to use a biblical phrase.
Great.
To end on.
Well, thanks, Paul. Thank you so much for your book, Rainbow Milk. People read this book. Thank you so much for the interview, Paul. Well, there you go. We're twins. Thank you so much. I hope to meet you one day in person, hopefully in the future. And good luck tonight with the elections and with everything you do. And hope to see your next book real soon. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Jasper. Okay. Nice to meet you. Take care.
Right now, dear people in the audience, in about 15 minutes, I guess, 20 minutes, you can see a pre-recorded live show from the band Keeley Forsyth from the UK, who have an album out called Debris. And they can't be here, obviously, because of the COVID virus. But they made something really special, especially for the Crossing Border Festival. And the final thing I really want to say is that, really, it's right now, actually. The recorded show is on. That if you to watch the whole festival is really free, like Michelle said at the beginning. But there is a donation button at the bit below your screen, and you can donate any amount you would like, so to help the festival along. Thank you very much.